For more than a year, Donald Trump has used one tool over and over again against Canada: tariffs, threats of tariffs, increases on tariffs that were already in place. And on top of that, a refusal to simply renew the trade agreement that both countries built their economies around. Canada has now given its answer, and it isn't a phone call, a concession, or another round of retaliatory tariffs. It's steel in the ground. On July 6th, 2026, the premiers of Alberta and Ontario stood together in Calgary and proposed a pipeline that would carry Canadian oil from one end of the country to the other without crossing a single mile of American territory. The project is called the Northern Shield Energy Corridor, and if it gets built, it would represent one of the clearest signals yet that Canada is done leaving its energy exports at the mercy of Washington. So let's break down exactly what was announced, why the timing matters so much, and whether this pipeline actually has a realistic path to construction, because the history behind this idea is more complicated than the headlines suggest. We'll start with the basics. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Ontario Premier Doug Ford unveiled the proposal at the Calgary Stampede, of all places, standing in front of a map that traced a new route across the country. The pipeline would run approximately 3,300 kilometers, or about 2,050 miles, starting at Hardisty, Alberta, the province's major oil storage and distribution hub, and ending at Sarnia, Ontario, home to one of Canada's largest refining clusters. Along the way, the proposed route would pass through Regina and Winnipeg before arcing north of Toronto on its way to Sarnia. Initial capacity is projected at around 500,000 barrels of oil per day, with officials saying the system could eventually be expanded to handle as much as 800,000 barrels daily. And this isn't meant to be the final stop either. Smith said the corridor could eventually be extended all the way to Canada's Atlantic coast, which would open the door to direct oil exports to Europe, something that is currently very difficult for landlocked Alberta crude to achieve without moving through the United States first. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the problem it's trying to solve. Right now, a significant portion of the oil moving from Western Canada to refineries in Ontario and Quebec doesn't take a direct Canadian route. It travels through the Enbridge pipeline network, which dips south into the American Midwest before crossing back into Canada near Sarnia. One of the key links in that system is Line 5, a 73-year-old pipeline that runs beneath the Straits of Mackinac, the narrow waterway separating Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Michigan's government has spent years trying to shut that pipeline down, citing its age and the environmental risk of a rupture in the Great Lakes. Enbridge has proposed replacing the underwater section with a protective tunnel, but that project has been stuck in permitting delays, lawsuits, and opposition from environmental and indigenous groups since 2018. Even under optimistic timelines, the tunnel isn't expected to be finished before 2031. And while a 1977 treaty between the US and Canada technically guarantees the uninterrupted transit of oil through pipelines like Line 5, the fact that Canada's east-west energy security depends on American courts, American state politics, and American infrastructure has become something Canadian officials are no longer willing to accept quietly. That discomfort has a direct connection to what's been happening in Washington. Over the past year and a half, the trade relationship between the two countries has deteriorated in ways that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. Trump's second term brought a wave of tariffs on Canadian goods, starting with a 25% tariff on most products in February 2025, with a reduced 10% rate carved out for Canadian energy exports. Steel, aluminum, and copper were later hit with tariffs as high as 50% under national security justifications. Autos and auto parts not qualifying for USMCA protections faced a 25% tariff. And the pressure didn't stop there. In July 2025, Trump threatened a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, which then actually took effect that August. By October, he added another 10% on top of that after Ontario ran a television ad using old audio clips of Ronald Reagan criticizing tariff policy, an ad Trump described as misleading and used as justification to cancel ongoing trade talks entirely. Then, on January 31st, 2026, he threatened to push tariffs on Canada as high as 50%. There was a brief window earlier this year when tensions seemed to be cooling. In August 2025, Carney announced Canada would drop many of its retaliatory tariffs by matching the exemptions built into USMCA, hoping the gesture would restart stalled negotiations. For a while, it seemed to work, with Carney telling reporters that Canada still had, in his words, the best trade deal with the United States of any country, even if it looked different from the arrangement both sides had grown used to. That goodwill didn't last, and it's worth noting the pattern didn't stop with tariffs on goods alone. In February 2026, Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a major new crossing between Windsor and Detroit, citing Canada's growing trade ties with China and what he described as an unfair arrangement in which Canada collects all toll revenue from the bridge to repay its construction costs. Threatening to hold up a piece of binational infrastructure that had already been built was, for many in Ottawa, a signal that almost nothing involving cross-border cooperation was safe from being used as leverage. And then came July 1st, 2026, arguably the moment that made this pipeline proposal feel urgent rather than aspirational. That date was the deadline for the United States, Canada, and Mexico to jointly decide whether to renew the USMCA trade agreement for another 16 years. Washington chose not to. Instead of a clean renewal, the deal now enters a decade of mandatory annual reviews, with the possibility of expiring altogether if the three countries can't resolve their disputes along the way. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer put it bluntly, saying the United States did not agree to renew the USMCA in its current form. Analysts at Jefferies estimated the odds of a full renewal at only around 10%, with a much higher probability, close to 75%, that the agreement simply drifts through years of unstable annual reviews. That kind of uncertainty is corrosive for any country that built its economic model around predictable access to its neighbor's market, and Canada built almost its entire modern economy around exactly that assumption. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been unusually direct about what this all means for Canada's strategy going forward. He said publicly that many of the country's traditional economic strengths, particularly its close ties to the United States, have now become vulnerabilities that need to be corrected. His government has set a target of doubling Canadian exports to non-US markets within the next decade, a goal that requires not just new trade agreements, but the physical infrastructure to actually move Canadian resources somewhere other than south across the border. The Northern Shield Pipeline is one piece of that picture, but it isn't the only one. Just about a week before the Calgary announcement, Carney and Smith unveiled a separate plan for a new pipeline to Canada's Pacific coast, designed to carry up to 1 million barrels of oil per day toward Asian export markets. Add in Enbridge's ongoing mainline expansion, a new pipeline called Bridger that will move oil from Alberta into Wyoming, and an expansion of the existing Trans Mountain system adding another 300,000 barrels of daily capacity. And you start to see the outline of a country making a coordinated attempt to add more than 2 million barrels a day of new export capacity, almost all of it aimed at reducing dependence on a single customer. Now here's where the story gets more interesting, because this isn't actually a new idea. Canada tried something remarkably similar just over a decade ago. Back in 2013, a company called TransCanada, now known as TC Energy, proposed a pipeline called Energy East. The concept was almost identical to what's being proposed now. Repurpose sections of an existing natural gas pipeline to carry oil from Alberta to refineries in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, with an export terminal on the Atlantic coast. It wasn't just about moving oil either. It was framed as building a sovereign, entirely Canadian energy corridor, an idea that traces back even further to a 1954 decision by Federal Minister C.D. Howe, who insisted that Canada's first major natural gas pipeline be built entirely on Canadian soil rather than dipping through the United States. Energy East carried that same philosophy, but it never got built. Quebec's government objected strongly to the project. Oil prices dropped sharply during the years the proposal was under review. And in a controversy that badly damaged public trust, it emerged that TransCanada had potentially compromised officials at Canada's National Energy Board during the approval process. By October 2017, the company canceled the project entirely, taking an estimated $1 billion after-tax financial hit in the process. So why bring this idea back now, nearly a decade after it collapsed? Because almost every argument against Energy East is weaker today, and almost every argument for it is stronger. Line 5 is older and more contested than it was in 2017. American trade policy is dramatically more aggressive and unpredictable than it was under the previous USMCA framework. And crucially, the political environment inside Canada has shifted. The federal government created something called the Major Projects Office in 2025 under legislation known as the Building Canada Act, specifically designed to accelerate major energy, mining, and infrastructure developments that would otherwise spend a decade crawling through overlapping regulatory reviews. That office is led by Dawn Farrell, the former chief executive of Trans Mountain, and its entire purpose is to compress timelines for projects the federal government considers nationally important. Whether the Northern Shield pipeline gets formally designated under that office remains to be seen, but the institutional machinery to fast-track it now exists in a way it didn't back when Energy East was falling apart. Before we get into where the project stands today, it's worth understanding just how aggressive the tariff timeline actually was, because the pipeline announcement doesn't make sense without it. The February 2025 executive order was only the opening move. In March, Trump briefly threatened to double steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% in direct response to Canadian retaliation, then walked the increase back within the same day. He also carved out a temporary exemption for goods covered under USMCA, only to extend that exemption indefinitely in April, creating a strange environment where roughly 38% of Canadian imports were technically shielded while everything else remained exposed to shifting rates. Then came the summer escalation. On July 10, 2025, Trump threatened a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, effective August 1st, and when that date arrived, the tariff actually went into effect exactly as threatened. Canadian officials had hoped, as they often did throughout this period, that the deadline would slip or the number would soften. It didn't. By October, following the Ontario advertisement dispute, Trump tacked on another 10% and canceled trade talks outright, a pattern of using tariffs not just as economic policy, but as a direct response to political messaging he found objectionable. Carney's own language captured the shift in mood inside Canada. Referring to the scale of the tariff increases, he said the United States had raised its tariffs to levels last seen during the Great Depression, and that many of the country's former strengths, built entirely around its closeness to the American market, had become weaknesses that needed correcting. That's not the language of a government hoping to patch things up quietly. It's the language of a government that has concluded the old relationship isn't coming back in its previous form, regardless of who occupies the White House afterward. It's also worth putting the Northern Shield proposal next to the other project Carney and Smith unveiled just days earlier, because together they tell a more complete story than either one does alone. The Pacific Coast Pipeline, aimed at moving up to 1 million barrels a day toward Asian markets, is really the export half of the equation. Northern Shield, running east instead of west, is more about domestic energy security and reducing Canada's use of American transit infrastructure for internal Canadian trade. Put those two together with the existing push toward liquefied natural gas terminals like the KC Lisms project in northern British Columbia, and a pattern becomes obvious. Canada isn't making one announcement. It's running two parallel infrastructure tracks at the same time, one focused on new customers overseas, and one focused on removing American choke points from its own internal supply chains, both under the umbrella of the same diversification strategy Carney has been describing since early last year. Let's talk about where things actually stand right now, because despite the big announcement, this project is still very early. A feasibility study is currently underway involving multiple consulting groups, and Alberta and Ontario officials say that study is expected to be completed by the end of this year. That study will examine costs, potential routes, and commercialization options, including whether the project moves forward as a private venture, a government-led initiative, or some combination of both. Doug Ford has said a private sector proponent would be preferred, but he's been clear that a government-led approach can't be ruled out if private capital doesn't materialize quickly enough. And that hesitation from industry is worth paying attention to. Some observers have pointed out that oil companies and their investors haven't fully committed capital to this project yet, which raises a broader question hanging over Canada's entire pipeline expansion strategy right now. Is there actually enough new oil production coming online to fill all these new pipelines being proposed at once? Between Northern Shield, the new Pacific Coastline, the Mainline expansion, Bridger, and the Trans Mountain expansion, Canada is potentially adding more than 2 million barrels a day of new export capacity. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has said she wants the province's crude output to double and has expressed confidence that production growth will keep pace, telling reporters she wants Alberta among the top 3 oil producers and exporters in the world. But confidence from a premier isn't the same as capital committed by producers. And that gap is one of the biggest open questions around this entire announcement. There's also the matter of who actually needs to say yes. The release from Alberta and Ontario referenced potential opportunities for Manitoba to join the project, given that the proposed route runs directly through Winnipeg, but there was no indication in the announcement that Manitoba's government had formally signed on. That matters more than it might seem, because provincial cooperation has been one of the biggest obstacles to Canadian pipeline projects historically. Energy East collapsed, partly because Quebec refused to get on board. For the Northern Shield corridor to work as envisioned, every province along that 3,300-kilometer route needs to be a willing partner. And recent Canadian pipeline history is full of examples where that kind of unanimous provincial support fell apart under environmental review, Indigenous consultation requirements, or straightforward regional politics. Speaking of which, this project is also entering a broader environment of political tension inside Canada itself. Alberta has an independence referendum scheduled for October 2026, and some commentators have raised the possibility that ambitious pipeline proposals like this one are, at least in part, aimed at showing Albertans that staying inside Confederation still delivers real economic wins. There's also friction over Canada's existing tanker ban off the northern coast of British Columbia, a policy that continues to limit oil export options even as new pipeline capacity gets proposed elsewhere. And industry skepticism runs deeper than just this one project. Some voices in the oil and gas sector have suggested that companies still don't fully trust the federal Liberal government not to interfere with development somewhere in the process, even with the new Major Projects Office designed to smooth that path. Public commentary since the announcement has ranged from strong support, particularly from those frustrated with Canada's reliance on Line 5, to considerable skepticism about whether the province-led announcement will translate into anything more than another feasibility study that quietly stalls out. Now, let's put some real numbers around what's actually at stake if Canada gets this wrong, or gets it right. The tariffs Trump has imposed since returning to office in 2025 represent, by some estimates, the largest tax increase as a share of GDP the United States has enacted since 1993, working out to roughly $1,500 per American household this year alone, according to the Tax Foundation. That's a cost being absorbed on the American side, but the trade uncertainty cuts both ways. Canadian tourism to the United States has dropped sharply, with one estimate putting February 2025 travel down 40% compared to the year before, a shift that could cost the American economy up to $4 billion annually if it continues. Canadian provinces have pulled American wine and liquor off their shelves in retaliation. And underlying all of it is the simple fact that the United States remains by far the largest single buyer of Canadian crude oil, even as Alberta sits on one of the largest proven oil reserves anywhere in the world. That dependency is precisely the vulnerability Carney has been talking about publicly, and it's precisely what pipelines like Northern Shield are designed to reduce. It's also worth being clear about what this pipeline would and wouldn't immediately solve. Even in the most optimistic scenario, Northern Shield is designed primarily to serve domestic Canadian demand first, moving oil to refineries in Ontario rather than immediately targeting new international buyers. The bigger export diversification story, the one aimed at Europe and Asia, depends on the coastal extensions and the separate Pacific Pipeline project actually getting built too, and both of those face their own regulatory and environmental battles. In other words, Northern Shield by itself doesn't instantly free Canada from its reliance on the American market. What it does is remove one specific point of leverage: the fact that oil moving between two Canadian provinces currently has to pass through American territory and, by extension, becomes subject to American courts, American politics, and American infrastructure decisions that Canada has no control over. So, stepping back, what's the actual takeaway here? This is not simply a pipeline announcement. It's a direct policy response to more than 18 months of escalating trade pressure from Washington, delivered less than a week after the United States refused to renew its foundational trade agreement with Canada. It revives an idea that failed once before, for reasons that were largely political and provincial rather than technical, and it's being relaunched inside a very different environment, one with a dedicated federal office built to accelerate major projects, a public that has grown increasingly frustrated with dependence on American infrastructure, and a prime minister who has made economic diversification away from the United States a defining goal of his government. Whether the Northern Shield Energy Corridor actually gets built is still genuinely uncertain. The feasibility study isn't even finished yet. Provincial buy-in beyond Alberta and Ontario hasn't been secured. Private capital hasn't been committed. And Canada's history with exactly this kind of project is not encouraging. But the direction of the policy is unmistakable, and it fits into a much larger pattern that's been building since Trump returned to office. Canada quietly, methodically building the infrastructure, it needs to stop being a country whose energy exports run through a single, increasingly unpredictable neighbor. There's one more piece of context that helps explain why Ottawa is willing to entertain so many large infrastructure proposals at once, even ones with uncertain odds of success. Carney's government has repeatedly framed export diversification, not as one project, but as a portfolio, the same way an investor might spread risk across multiple assets rather than betting everything on a single outcome. Some of these projects, like the Pacific Pipeline or the LNG terminals already under construction in British Columbia, are further along and more likely to actually reach completion. Others, like Northern Shield, are earlier stage bets that may take years of provincial negotiation, environmental review, and Indigenous consultation before a single length of pipe goes into the ground. Canadian officials seem to understand this. Publicly, they've been careful not to promise that Northern Shield is guaranteed to happen, framing it instead as an option Canada wants developed and ready, rather than a certainty. That's a meaningfully different posture than the one taken around Energy East a decade ago, when TransCanada moved forward with far more confidence and far less political cover, only to watch the project collapse under regulatory and provincial pressure it hadn't fully accounted for. Whether that effort succeeds or joins Energy East as another ambitious Canadian pipeline that never made it out of the planning stage, will likely become one of the defining economic stories to watch over the rest of this decade.